I never thought I'd believe in ghosts, but after what happened to me on that farm, there's no denying it anymore. My name's Jake, and this is my story. Believe it or not, but what I'm about to tell you is the absolute truth. It all started when my girlfriend Emma and I decided to spend a weekend away from the city. We rented a little farmhouse off an old dirt road in rural Indiana. It was advertised as rustic and charming, but when we pulled up, it looked more like something out of a horror movie. The paint was peeling off the wood siding, the windows were caked in grime, and the barn in the distance looked like it hadn't seen use in decades. Emma was hesitant, but I convinced her it was just atmosphere. I didn't want to admit that I already felt uneasy. The owner, a wiry old man named Mr. Harper, met us at the door. He handed me the key, his bony hand brushing mine, and for a moment, he stared into my eyes like he was trying to warn me of something. Then he muttered, "If you hear anything at night, don't go looking for it. Just stay inside." I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of joke, but Emma looked spooked. Once he left, I tried to lighten the mood. "Old man's just trying to scare the city kids," I joked. But Emma wasn't having it. That first night, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows and making the whole house creak. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like whispering coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Soft, deliberate, almost pleading. "Jake," it whispered. My name. I froze. My rational brain told me it had to be the wind, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone for a flashlight and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but colder than I expected. A draft, I told myself. The old house wasn't insulated properly. As I walked down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, leading me to the living room. And that's when I saw it. A figure, translucent, glowing faintly in the moonlight, stood near the front door. It was a woman in a tattered dress, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out now. She pointed toward the barn. I backed away slowly, slamming the bedroom door and waking Emma. I didn't tell her what I saw. I just said I thought I heard animals outside. She didn't believe me, but she was too tired to argue. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a dream. Emma and I spent the day exploring the property, even though the barn gave us both the creeps. Its doors hung open like a gaping mouth, and every so often I thought I saw movement inside. Emma refused to go near it, so we stuck to the fields. That night, the whispers started again, but this time they were louder. I couldn't pretend it was the wind anymore. Emma heard them too and begged me not to go investigating, but I had to. As I stepped into the hallway, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me, and the whispers seemed to surround me, coming from everywhere at once. "Jake." The voice was clear now, and it was coming from outside. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the front door, ignoring Emma's pleas to stay put. When I stepped onto the porch, the whispers stopped. The air was unnervingly still. Then I heard it, the sound of a child giggling coming from the barn. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I walked toward the barn. The giggling grew louder, echoing off the rotting walls. When I stepped inside, the stench of decay hit me like a brick. My flashlight beam danced over old tools, rusted chains, and something that looked like dried blood on the floor. And then I saw her again, the woman from the night before. She was standing in the center of the barn, her head still tilted, her eyes wide and unblinking. She raised a hand and pointed to the ground. There was something buried there, under the dirt. I didn't want to dig, but it was like I wasn't in control of my own body. I grabbed an old spade and started digging. Emma's voice broke through the whispers, calling my name from the house, but I couldn't stop. After a few minutes, the spade hit something solid. I brushed away the dirt and uncovered a wooden box. It was nailed shut, but the wood was so old and rotten that I pried it open with my hands. Inside were bones. Small bones. Human bones. My stomach turned as I realized what I was looking at. A child. The whispers turned into screams. The barn door slammed shut behind me, and the flashlight flickered, plunging me into near darkness. "Why are you here?" a voice growled, low and guttural. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just shadows moving unnaturally along the walls. Then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. Cold, impossibly cold. I ran. I don't even remember making it back to the house, but when I did, I found Emma standing on the porch, tears streaming down her face. "We have to leave," she said. "Now." We didn't even pack. We jumped in the car and sped down that dirt road as fast as we could. As we drove, Emma told me she'd seen the woman too, standing in the field, watching the house. When we got back to the city, I did some research on the property. Turns out the farm had a dark history. The original owner, a man named Jeremiah Colton, had gone mad in the late 1800s and murdered his wife and children before hanging himself in the barn. The bodies of the children were never found. Until now, I don't know what I unleashed that night, but sometimes I still hear whispers in the dark. And every so often when I close my eyes, I see her face, tilted unblinking, pointing at me.
Story number 2.
They call it the Hollow Field, but the locals just refer to it as cursed land. They say nothing grows there anymore, not since the murder. I didn't know any of that when I took the job helping an older couple, the Millers, restore their rundown farm. If I had known, I would have never set foot on that cursed ground. The Millers were sweet but secretive. Mr. Miller had a hollow, sunken face that looked like he hadn't slept in years. Mrs. Miller was kind, but constantly looking over her shoulder, as if something unseen was watching. The first day I arrived, I asked about the old scarecrow in the middle of the field. It stood out. Its straw-stuffed frame was bloated and lopsided, with a head made from a burlap sack that had long since darkened with age and mildew. Its arms were spread wide as though mocking the heavens. "Don't touch it," Mr. Miller said sharply, his voice trembling. "Why not?" I asked. It's just tradition," he muttered, and his wife quickly changed the subject. That night, I stayed in the small guest house near the main barn. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the thin windows. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard it, a scratching sound. At first, I thought it was mice in the walls, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from outside. Reluctantly, I got up and looked out the window. The moon was bright, casting an eerie glow over the field, and that's when I saw it. The scarecrow. It wasn't in the middle of the field anymore. It was closer, leaning slightly to one side as if caught mid-step. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. It had to be a trick of the moonlight. But when I looked again, it was still there, closer to the guest house than it had any right to be. I slammed the curtains shut and crawled back into bed, telling myself I was just imagining things. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, I walked out to the field with a sick feeling in my stomach. The scarecrow was back in its original position, standing rigid in the center of the field. I asked Mr. Miller if he'd moved it, but he just gave me a strange look and said, "It doesn't move unless it wants to." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but his face remained grim. That day, I worked on repairing the barn while trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. The sun was hot and the air was thick with the smell of dirt and hay, but no matter how much I tried to focus, my eyes kept drifting back to the scarecrow. It was the way its head was tilted, like it was looking at me. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. The Millers invited me to dinner, and I hoped a warm meal would distract me from my growing unease. But halfway through the meal, I noticed Mrs. Miller's hands were trembling as she poured me a cup of tea. "Is something wrong?" I asked. She exchanged a glance with her husband before saying, "You should leave. Tonight." Her words hit me like a slap. "What? Why?" Mr. Miller sighed and leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That scarecrow, it isn't just for show. It's a guardian of sorts. Or at least it used to be. But now..." He trailed off, his eyes darting toward the window. Mrs. Miller finished for him. "Now it's angry, and it's hungry." I thought they were crazy, but the fear in their eyes was undeniable. I decided to humor them, saying I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, the scratching came back, louder this time, more frantic. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as I stared at the locked door. Then I heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper coming from just outside the window. "Come outside," it said. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. Slowly, I reached for my phone to call for help, but when I turned on the screen, the signal was gone. The whisper came again, this time more insistent. "Come outside." Against every instinct, I got up and looked out the window. The scarecrow was no longer in the field. It was standing just a few feet from the guest house, its sackcloth head now torn, revealing something dark and rotted underneath. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The door rattled violently and I screamed, grabbing the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a rusted hammer from my toolkit. The rattling stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the house. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner, clutching the hammer and praying for the sun to rise. When dawn finally broke, I ran to the main house, pounding on the Miller's door. They didn't answer. I went inside and found the place empty. Plates of uneaten food still sat on the dining table, and the back door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. I walked to the edge of the field, calling their names, but the only sound was the wind rustling through the dead stalks. And then I saw it. The scarecrow was back in the center of the field, but it wasn't alone. Two more figures hung beside it, their arms stretched wide, their heads slumped forward. I didn't need to get closer to know who they were. I ran to my truck and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. The Millers were never reported missing. When I tried to tell the sheriff what I saw, he just looked at me like I was crazy and told me to stay away from the hollow field. But I can't stop thinking about it. About how the scarecrow looked at me that night, and how sometimes when I'm alone I hear its voice whispering again.
Story number 3.
When my Aunt Linda passed, she left me her old farmhouse. It wasn't exactly a gift I wanted. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, and even back then, the place had given me nightmares. The property was isolated, surrounded by dense woods and a small overgrown cemetery behind the barn. My mom used to say the house had a bad history, but she never went into detail. Still, I was broke and needed somewhere to live, so I packed up my life and moved in. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no crickets, just an oppressive, unnatural silence that seemed to swallow everything. I chalked it up to being in the middle of nowhere, but it felt wrong. The house hadn't changed much since I was a kid. The furniture was the same, covered in a thin layer of dust. The wallpaper was peeling and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. It was as if time had stopped the day my aunt died. The first few nights were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the room, or a flicker of something in the window. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, as I was unpacking in the living room, I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate creaking across the old wooden floorboards. My stomach dropped. I grabbed a flashlight and headed up the narrow staircase, every step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway was empty, but the air was colder than it should have been. My breath fogged in front of me as I opened the door to the master bedroom. It was empty. I let out a shaky laugh, convincing myself it was just the house settling. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, this time coming from behind me. I spun around, like shining the flashlight toward the corner of the room. That's when I saw it. A figure, hunched and gaunt, standing in the shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like an animal's. I dropped the flashlight and bolted, slamming the bedroom door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew better. The real terror began 2 nights later. I was lying in bed when I heard a faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming against glass. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, and there it was. A pale, skeletal face pressed against the glass, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck the light out of the room. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, knocking over the lamp in my panic. By the time I mustered the courage to look again, the face was gone. The next morning, I found smudged handprints on the outside of the window, too large to be human. I should have left right then, but something kept me there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the house itself, keeping me trapped. I decided to search the property, starting with the cemetery behind the barn. The graves were old, the headstones weathered and crumbling. Most of the names were illegible, but one caught my eye. Eleanor Green, 1895 to 1923. I didn't know much about my aunt's family, but I remembered hearing stories about a relative named Eleanor who died young. My mom had always refused to talk about her, saying it was bad luck. That night, I dreamed of Eleanor. She was sitting at the edge of my bed, her head tilted at an odd angle, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't say a word, but her mouth moved, forming silent words. When I woke up, there were bruises on my arms as if someone had grabbed me in my sleep. The following days were a blur of strange occurrences. Lights flickered on and off, doors slammed shut on their own, objects moved when I wasn't looking, and always I felt that presence, watching, waiting. One night, I decided to confront whatever it was. I armed myself with a flashlight and an old Bible I found in my aunt's room. I waited until midnight when the house was at its quietest and started calling out. "I know you're here," I shouted, my voice shaking. What do you want? For a moment, there was silence. Then the air grew heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. A low, guttural voice echoed through the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Leave. The lights flickered violently and the walls seemed to shudder. The figure from the bedroom appeared again, but this time it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy shapes swarmed around it, their faces twisted in agony. I stumbled backward, clutching the Bible as if it would save me. "Who are you?" I whispered. The figure stepped closer, its bony hand reaching out. "Eleanor," it rasped. The shadows surged forward, and I blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning. The house was eerily quiet, and the heavy feeling was gone. But something had changed. I packed my things and left that day, vowing never to return. I later found out that Eleanor Green had been my great-grandmother's sister. She died violently, though the details were vague. Some said she was murdered by a jealous lover. Others claimed she was cursed by the townsfolk, accused of witchcraft. Whatever happened to her, it left a mark on that house and on me. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear that tapping on the window. And sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I catch a glimpse of her behind me, watching with that same unnatural grin. I don't know what she wanted, and I hope I never find out.
Story number 4.
I used to think ghost stories were just that, stories. Until I spent the worst night of my life in a place called Black Hollow Farm. I was on a road trip with my buddy Lucas when our car broke down in the middle of nowhere. We were miles from the nearest town, the sun was setting fast, and our phones had no signal. That's when we saw it, a farmhouse in the distance, surrounded by overgrown fields and shrouded in mist. It looked abandoned, but we were desperate. When we reached the property, the place was even creepier up close. The house was weathered and sagging, its windows like dark, empty eyes. The barn loomed behind it, its doors slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Lucas knocked on the door while I hung back, the uneasy feeling in my gut growing stronger with every second. After a moment, the door swung open, and a woman stood there. She was pale, with long, stringy black hair and a dress that looked like it belonged in another century. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but unsettling. Lucas explained our situation, and to my surprise, she invited us in. "You can stay the night," she said, "but you should leave first thing in the morning." Her warning sent a chill down my spine, but Lucas seemed unfazed. He thanked her, and we stepped inside. The house was dark and cold, and the smell of mildew hung heavy in the air. The furniture was old and covered in dust, as if no one had lived there for years. The woman introduced herself as Martha. She didn't say much, just told us we could sleep in the guest room upstairs. "Don't wander around at night," she said before retreating to a back room. Lucas laughed it off as we climbed the creaking staircase. "She's just trying to scare us," he said, but I wasn't so sure. The guest room was small and bare, with 2 twin beds and a single window overlooking the fields. As I lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of the old house. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to a sound, a faint scratching like nails against wood. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. Then it came again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I turned to Lucas, but he was sound asleep. Summoning my courage, I crept to the window and peered out. The mist had thickened, blanketing the fields in an eerie white glow, and then I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing in the middle of the field. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, piercing through the fog, staring directly at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked again, it was gone. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. I shook Lucas awake, whispering, "Something's not right." Groggy and annoyed, he told me to relax and go back to sleep. But then he heard it too, the scratching, now accompanied by faint whispers. "Maybe it's Martha," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. We grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder than before, and every shadow seemed to move just out of sight. The whispers grew louder as we approached the staircase. They were coming from the barn. "I don't think this is a good idea," I said. But Lucas was already heading for the door. The night air was bitterly cold, and the mist seemed to wrap around us like a living thing. The barn loomed ahead, its doors hanging open like the jaws of some great beast. As we stepped inside, the whispers stopped. The barn was empty except for a pile of hay and old farming tools. But then my flashlight beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. a row of wooden crosses crudely made and covered in what looked like dried blood. Each one had a name carved into it, and one of them had my name. Lucas, I whispered, my voice trembling. He turned, his flashlight shaking as it scanned the crosses. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. "Run," Lucas said, his voice barely audible. We bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before we could reach it. The growling grew louder, and from the darkness emerged the figure I'd seen in the field. It was taller than any man, its limbs impossibly long and twisted. Its face was a void, featureless except for two glowing red eyes that burned with malice. Lucas screamed, and the thing lunged at him. I don't know how I managed to move, but I grabbed an old pitchfork and swung it at the creature. It let out a terrible screech, retreating into the shadows. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. Somehow, we forced the door open and ran back to the house. Martha was waiting for us in the doorway, her expression grim. "You saw it," she said. "It wasn't a question. What is that thing?" Lucas demanded, his voice shaking. "It's what's left of him," she said. "The farmer who built this place. He went mad, killed his family, and buried them in the barn. When the townsfolk found out, they burned him alive. But he didn't stay dead." "Why didn't you tell us?" I shouted. "I tried to warn you," she said. "But now it's too late. Once you've seen him, he doesn't let you leave." We didn't stick around to find out if she was right. At first light, we jumped in the car and drove until the farmhouse was a distant memory. But the nightmare didn't end there. A week later, Lucas called me in the middle of the night. He was panicked, saying he'd seen the figure outside his apartment. 2 days later, he was gone. No trace, no explanation, just gone. And now, I feel it. The cold, the silence, the unmistakable presence of something watching me. I know it's coming for me too.
Story number 5.
I never believed in ghosts, curses, or haunted places. That changed when I spent a weekend at Ridgewood Farm. It started as a simple favor. My friend Maggie inherited the farm after her grandfather's sudden passing. She needed help cleaning it up to prepare it for sale, and since I owed her one, I agreed to tag along. Ridgewood Farm sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by fields of withered crops and dense woods. The farmhouse was old, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. There was a barn, too, its red exterior faded to a dull, sickly brown. Maggie told me her grandfather had been a reclusive man in his final years, rarely leaving the farm. He wasn't himself, she said, avoiding my gaze. I didn't press her for details, but something about the way she said it unsettled me. The first day passed uneventfully. We spent most of it cleaning the kitchen and clearing cobwebs from the corners. As evening fell, the farmhouse grew colder, the old wooden floor creaking beneath our footsteps. It was around midnight when the first strange thing happened. I woke to the sound of someone walking upstairs. The heavy, deliberate footsteps moved back and forth, pausing occasionally as if whoever it was listening. I glanced at Maggie, asleep on the couch across the room, and my heart sank. We were the only ones there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint, rotting smell hit my nose. At the top of the stairs, the hallway was dark and silent. I shone the flashlight toward the far end, where the door to the master bedroom was ajar. The beam of light flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, something slipping into the shadows. "Maggie?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. I stepped closer, my hand shaking as I reached for the door. When I pushed it open, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the wardrobe closed, but something caught my eye, a faint outline of muddy footprints leading from the doorway to the corner of the room. Then the flashlight died. Panic surged through me as the darkness swallowed the room. I backed out, tripping over the doorframe, and stumbled back down the stairs. Maggie was awake now, sitting up on the couch, her face pale. "What's wrong?" she asked. "There's someone here," I said, my voice shaking. Her expression darkened. "It's him," she whispered. "Who?" She hesitated, then said, "My grandfather. Or what's left of him." That night, Maggie told me everything. Her grandfather had become obsessed with the idea that the farm was cursed. He claimed to see figures in the fields at night, shadowy shapes that moved through the crops, watching him. Toward the end, he started acting erratically, digging holes in the yard, muttering about burying the darkness. "He wasn't crazy," Maggie said. "He was trying to protect us." "From what?" I asked. Maggie didn't answer. The next morning, we decided to check the barn. Maggie said her grandfather spent most of his time there in the months before he died, say, locking himself inside for hours at a time. The barn was even creepier than the house. The air was thick with the smell of damp hay and decay, and the floor was littered with broken tools and scraps of wood. In the corner, we found a trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. Maggie hesitated, but I pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. "What is this?" I asked. "I don't know," Maggie said. "I've never seen it before." Against our better judgment, we descended into the cellar. The air was freezing, and the walls were lined with crude wooden shelves, each one holding jars filled with murky, foul-smelling liquid. At the far end of the room was a large, circular pit. Something was inside it. As we approached, the pit began to emit a low, rumbling sound, like a distant growl. Maggie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely audible. I shone the flashlight into the pit. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, a writhing mass of dark, sinewy shapes, twisting and pulsing as if alive. The growling grew louder, and a foul stench filled the room, making me gag. Then the shapes began to rise. Maggie screamed, and we bolted up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind us. The barn shuddered as if something massive was moving beneath it, and a deep guttural voice echoed through the air. "Leave." We ran back to the farmhouse, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was holding us hostage. The windows rattled and the walls groaned. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a shadowy figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by darkness. "It's him," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling. The figure began to descend, its movements slow and deliberate. As it reached the bottom step, it raised one hand, pointing directly at us. The growling from the barn grew louder, and the floor beneath us began to crack. Maggie grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back door. This time it opened. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping, until we reached the edge of the woods. When we turned back, the farmhouse was gone. Not burned, not crumbled, just gone. The fields were overgrown, the barn reduced to a pile of rotted wood. It was as if the entire place had been swallowed by the earth. We called the police, but they found nothing. No house, no barn, no sign that anyone had lived there in decades. Maggie sold the property to the county, who declared it unsuitable for development. We never spoke about what happened, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that growling sound in my dreams, and when I wake up, I swear I can smell damp hay and rotting wood.
Story number 6.
I was working as a farmhand when it happened. The property, known locally as Hollow Creek Farm, was as old as the town itself. Rumors swirled around the place, stories of missing people, strange sounds, and cursed soil. I didn't believe any of it. I was just there for the paycheck. The owner, Mr. Caldwell, was a quiet man, always keeping to himself. He gave me simple tasks: mend the fences, feed the animals, and stay out of the barn at night. "Don't ask why," he said one evening, his weathered face pale in the twilight. I should have listened. It started on my third night. I was in the farmhouse kitchen, eating dinner, when I heard it. Low, guttural moans carried on the wind. It sounded like someone was in pain. I glanced out the window, but the fields were empty, bathed in the pale light of the full moon. I told myself it was the wind. The next day, as I worked the fields, I found something strange. A patch of the ground had been disturbed, as if someone had been digging. The soil was loose and dark, but what caught my eye was a piece of cloth sticking out from the dirt. It looked old, frayed, and stained. I pulled at it, and the ground gave way, revealing a skeletal hand. My stomach turned, and I stumbled back. When I told Mr. Caldwell, he just nodded, his expression grim. "Don't touch it," he said. "Leave it be." That night, the moaning returned, louder and closer. It wasn't the wind, it was coming from the barn. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with questions. Who did the hand belong to? Why was Mr. Caldwell so calm about it? And what was making that awful sound? By midnight, curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight, I headed for the barn. The old building loomed in the darkness, its wooden slats creaking in the wind. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp hay and something metallic like rust or blood. I pushed open the door, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive. The moaning was louder now, coming from the far corner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just the sound of my own breathing and the creak of the barn's wooden floor. As I moved closer, my flashlight caught something hanging from the rafters, large hooks, rusted and stained with dark streaks. Beneath them was a makeshift altar, piled with bones, feathers, and what looked like animal carcasses. Then I saw it. A figure crouched in the corner, its back to me. Its body was twisted and hunched, its skin pale and stretched tight over jagged bones. It was clawing at the dirt, making that awful moaning sound. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice breaking. The figure froze. Slowly, it turned its head toward me, and I wished I had stayed in bed. Its face, or what was left of it, was a grotesque mask of decay. Empty eye sockets oozed black ichor, and its mouth was filled with jagged, broken teeth. It let out a guttural screech and lunged at me. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the farmhouse, but I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it tight. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. That's when I saw Mr. Caldwell standing in the kitchen, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. "You went to the barn," he said, his voice flat. "What the hell is that thing?" I demanded. "It's her," he said, his shoulders slumping. "My wife." I stared at him in disbelief. "Years ago, this farm was cursed," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "A woman came to us begging for food. We turned her away. She cursed us, said the land would rot and we'd suffer as she had." My wife laughed, mocked her. That night, my wife fell ill. By morning, she was gone, or so I thought. His voice broke and he sank into a chair. "She didn't die. Not really. The curse kept her here, as like trapped, twisted. I've tried to keep her contained, but she grows stronger. The land feeds her." "Why didn't you leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "This is my burden, my punishment. But now that you've seen her, you're part of it too." The moaning outside grew louder, more desperate. The walls of the farmhouse seemed to tremble. "She knows you're here," he said, his eyes wide with fear. "You need to leave. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my keys and ran for my truck, but the engine wouldn't start. The moaning was deafening now, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. That's when I saw her, standing in the middle of the driveway. Her twisted form was illuminated by the moonlight, her empty eyes fixed on me. She raised one clawed hand, and the truck's engine died completely. I stumbled out, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. She moved closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. Just as she reached me, Mr. Caldwell appeared, holding a large rusted scythe. "Go," he shouted. "I'll hold her off." I didn't argue. I ran into the woods, the sounds of their struggle echoing behind me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself on the main road, flagged down a passing car, and got out of there. When I returned with the police the next day, the farm was gone. Not burned, not abandoned, gone as if it had never existed. I tried to forget what happened, but I still hear her moaning in my dreams. And sometimes when I'm alone, I catch glimpses of her twisted form in the shadows, waiting, watching.
Story number 7.
I never should have taken the job at Dawson Hollow Farm. It was meant to be a fresh start after everything fell apart back home. The ad promised free room and board in exchange for a little manual labor. It sounded like a perfect escape. The farm was tucked away in a valley surrounded by thick woods, the kind of place that felt disconnected from the rest of the world. It looked picturesque at first glance. Rolling fields, a weathered barn, and a 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint. Mr. Dawson was an odd man. He was wiry, with sunken eyes and a voice as gravelly as the dirt road leading to the farm. He rarely spoke, only giving curt instructions about feeding the animals and repairing fences. There were no other workers, and it became clear he didn't want to talk about why. But what unnerved me most was the rule. Don't go near the silo at night. When I asked why, he just muttered, "It's not safe," and walked away. At first, I didn't think much of it. The days were long and tiring, leaving me too exhausted to do anything but collapse into bed. But on my 4th night, something strange happened. I woke up around midnight to a sound, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It wasn't coming from the house. I got out of bed, peered out the window, and saw a faint light emanating from the direction of the silo. It pulsed, glowing brighter and dimmer in time with the humming. Every instinct told me to stay put, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and crept outside. The night air was cold, and the farm was eerily silent apart from that unearthly hum. As I approached the silo, the light grew brighter, spilling through the cracks in the weathered metal. The door to the silo was ajar. I hesitated, but something compelled me to look inside. The interior of the silo was nothing like I expected. The walls were covered in strange, intricate symbols, carved deep into the metal. The floor was bare dirt, but in the center was a gaping hole, perfectly round and glowing with an otherworldly blue light. The hum was deafening now, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest. That's when I saw them. Figures began to emerge from the hole, one by one. Their bodies were long and thin, their limbs unnaturally elongated, and their skin was translucent, glowing faintly in the blue light. They moved with a jerky, insect-like precision, their empty faces scanning the room as if searching for something. I backed away, trying to keep quiet, but my foot caught on a loose stone, and I stumbled. The creatures turned toward me, their eyeless heads tilting in unison. Then they screamed. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, high-pitched, guttural, and filled with rage. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the house, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. Mr. Dawson was waiting for me in the kitchen. "You looked, didn't you?" he said, his voice low and trembling. I nodded, too terrified to speak. His expression was grim. "You've seen them now. They'll come for you." I wanted to believe he was lying, that this was some cruel joke, but the terror in his eyes was undeniable. "What are they?" I whispered. He sat down heavily at the table. "I don't know what they are. My grandfather built this farm, and the silo's been here longer than anyone can remember. He said it was a doorway, and that something terrible lived on the other side. Why not destroy it?" I asked. He shook his head. "We tried. Burned it, knocked it down, even filled the hole with concrete. But it always comes back. The doorway won't close." The sound of scratching interrupted us, faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from the windows, the walls, the ceiling. "They're here," Mr. Dawson said, his face pale. He grabbed a shotgun from the corner and handed me a lantern. "Stay close. Whatever you do, don't let them touch you." The next few hours were a blur of terror. The creatures surrounded the house, their glowing forms visible through the windows. They scratched at the walls, their screams echoing through the night. Mr. Dawson fired at them, but it didn't seem to do much. The bullets slowed them down, but they kept coming, relentless and unyielding. At some point, the lights went out, plunging the house into darkness. The only light came from the lantern and the creature's eerie glow. Then the door gave way. They poured into the house, their twisted forms moving with horrifying speed. Mr. Dawson shouted for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. One of them grabbed him, its long fingers wrapping around his arm. He screamed as its touch burned through his skin, and within moments he was gone, reduced to ash. I fled up the stairs, barricading myself in the attic. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the lantern. For hours I listened to them tearing through the house, their screams and growls filling the air. But as the first light of dawn broke, the noise stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the attic, the house was empty. The walls were scorched, the furniture destroyed, but the creatures were gone. The silo, however, was still there. I didn't stay to see what would happen next. I packed what little I had and left, driving until I reached the next town. I've tried to move on, but I can't escape the memory of those creatures. Sometimes late at night, I hear that hum again, faint and distant, as if calling to me. And I know, deep down, that the doorway is still open.
Story number 8.
I should have listened to the locals. Every single one of them warned me about Black Hollow Farm. But at the time, I was too arrogant, too desperate to get out of the city and live a quieter life. The property was a steal. 200 acres of farmland, a crumbling barn, and a colonial-era farmhouse for less than half the market value. "It's got history," the realtor had said with a forced smile. She neglected to mention it was the kind of history that didn't stay buried. The first few days were uneventful. I busied myself clearing out the overgrown fields and patching up the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, it was little things. A shadow flitting across the upstairs window, the faint sound of whispers when the wind picked up. Then I found the well. It was hidden behind the barn, covered with a rusted metal grate. The stones were ancient, weathered by time, and the opening was wide enough for a person to fall through. When I leaned over to peer inside, the smell hit me first. Wet earth and decay. "Don't mess with the well," the cashier at the feed store told me later that day when I mentioned it. Her face went pale, and she crossed herself. "Why?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "Bad things happen to people who do." I laughed it off, thinking she was just superstitious. But that night, I heard it for the first time. A low, mournful wail echoed across the property, rising and falling like a distant song. It was coming from the direction of the well. I told myself it was the wind, maybe an animal, but the sound didn't stop. It went on for hours, long after the wind had died and the woods had fallen silent. The next morning, I decided to check it out. Armed with a flashlight, I removed the grate and peered inside. The light barely penetrated the darkness, but I could see something glinting at the bottom, something metallic. Curiosity got the better of me. I tied a rope around the nearby post and lowered myself down. The air inside the well was cold and damp, and the deeper I went, the more the walls seemed to close in around me. When I reached the bottom, I found an old iron box, half buried in the mud. As soon as I touched it, the wailing stopped. I don't know what I expected to find when I pried the box open, but it wasn't what I saw. Inside were fragments of bone, yellowed with age, and a small blood-stained doll. A chill ran through me and I scrambled back up the rope, leaving the box behind. That night, the noises changed. The wailing was replaced by whispers, soft, guttural voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded angry, accusing. Then came the footsteps. They started just after midnight, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. I locked my bedroom door and stayed under the covers, too terrified to move. By morning, I was ready to leave. I packed a bag, loaded my truck, and didn't look back. But the farm wasn't done with me. The truck wouldn't start, no matter how many times I turned the key. The engine sputtered and coughed, but it refused to come to life. The whispers grew louder, now coming from outside the truck. I locked the doors and sat there, heart pounding, as shadows began to move across the yard. One of them stopped near the well. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was obscured by darkness. It tilted its head as if listening, then turned slowly toward me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, but when I finally looked up, the shadow was gone. I spent the next day trying to fix the truck, but every attempt failed. By nightfall, I was too exhausted to care and collapsed into bed. I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard anyone enter the house, but there was no mistaking the sound of footsteps crossing the floor. The whispers were back, louder now, almost deafening. Then I saw her. She stood at the foot of my bed, a little girl, no older than 6, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She held the blood-stained doll in her arms, and her hollow eyes bore into mine. "Why did you take it?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, my throat dry. "I'm sorry." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked out of the room, the whispers following her. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I was determined to fix what I had done. I grabbed the iron box from the well and reburied it in the woods, far from the farm. The whispers stopped after that, but the shadows didn't leave. I sold the property a week later, taking a massive loss just to get out. The new owners seemed eager to move in, despite my vague warnings about the place. I tried to put it behind me, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Every night, I dream of that little girl, her empty eyes staring into mine. And sometimes when I wake, I swear I hear whispers in the dark.